Hello, everybody, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this invitation. As was said by my predecessors, last year we were together in Bonn physically, and this was really nice. And yeah, now we just explore a new disruptive way of being together. But I'm very delighted to have the possibility to participate in the discussion. Next slide, please. I think it's excellent that I come after the presentation of Ricardo, because I can very much build on what he has explained. And as we heard before, the renewable electricity developments have been very positive. The last years led to cost reductions, and I think this is really something which is very important to keep in mind, and is also guiding the way on a stronger, more accelerated expansion of renewable energy. Now, it's not about going back to the past, but I think it's looking at what happened last year is quite important to also see what structural challenges we have to learn from these and overcome these barriers. Next slide, please. One big challenge is, even though renewable power capacities have accelerated significantly, and we saw it, 70% of the new capacities are today renewable power capacities, the investment have not increased significantly. This is obviously linked to one side to significant cost reductions of photovoltaics and wind in particular, but it's also that we're really not where we should be if we're serious about Paris and the sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. And I feel actually that this slide will at least accompany me for another couple of years. It's to show that indeed in the power sector, many advancements are happening. Here we have a share of renewable energy of 26.4%, but over 80% of the energy demand is occurring for heating, cooling, so in the building and industry sector and transport. So that's also why it's really important to have studies, research being done on how to decarbonize and how to develop renewable energy in carbon-intensive sectors. But there are many solutions which already exist today and can be implemented in the building sector, for instance, also in industry in some areas, and in transport. And these go through some extent to electrification of these sectors, but there are other solutions that can be implemented. So it's clear that we need to move from a power transition to an energy transition when it's about a renewable energy expansion. Next slide, please. And here we see the other part, which is you see the crazy and very encouraging increase of renewable energy. That the yellow part on the bottom, with a growth rate of 21.5%. However, the energy demand is of 7.2%, and fossil fuel increases in capacities is of 5.7%. And the level of renewable energy is so low that it does not allow for the moment. So we really need to have an exponential expansion of renewable energy capacity. Next slide, please. And here comes the big moment and opportunity we see linked to COVID and the economic recovery, and some countries really managed to build on this. The reality is, however, that this is not the case everywhere. This is an analysis which is done by IASD and several research partners that have analyzed actually the economic recovery packages. What we see first is that energy on the supply and the demand side represents more or less only 2% of the investments going into the economic recovery. So only 2%. So here, very clearly, there's not really an acknowledgement of the key role renewable energy plays actually in driving the economies. What we also see is that from the 151 billion, from the budget, I don't recall what it is, 151 billion go into fossil fuel and 89 billion go into clean energy after the pandemic. And that is clearly a challenge which we also need to address. Next slide, please. I will not go into detail here. This is not only looking into energy and renewable energy, but it's looking into the green stimulus package. So there is a carbon aspect, there is biodiversity aspect, and the countries basically positive and negative contributions. There are really good examples, and I think we have some key players here around the table. There is the Republic of Korea with regard to this. There is also the European Commission. But we see that there is quite, and this is an analysis on 17 countries, a reality that some aspects of some countries are really not using this opportunity the economic recovery does present. Next slide, please. So what should we learn from the past? And I think this is where innovation is key, but not only technological innovation. To build basically public support for renewables, and public is here broad, we need social political acceptance. So this really means like making renewable energy and energy efficiency a priority at the policy level, because planning, policies, and regulatory frameworks are key. We need to have a market acceptance. And here again, we do not only speak about the energy supply side, but also the energy consumers. And we clearly need to have a transition accompanying basically players from the more conventional space into these new opportunities. Plus, we need citizens' acceptance, and I think we have some speakers later who will also address this. We do see that there is in some local areas, even though there is opinion polls are really supporting renewable energy globally, locally there is a lot of pushback, which is really a barrier, a key barrier in deploying and accelerating the expansion. Next slide, please. And this will. In this context, I spoke about innovation, also governance innovation. There are key opportunities to understand the drivers for renewable energy, because these allow to make renewable energy relevant for decision makers outside of the energy sphere. And that is something which is fundamental. Clean air and healthy environment at the city's level, obviously globally CO2 emissions, economic opportunities, decent jobs, affordable inclusive energy, and energy security and sovereignty. And that is something where as players and decision makers and leaders, we really need to strengthen our narratives to use the advantages and make renewable energy relevant. Next slide, please. So that's my final slide. There are structural challenges that exist. And it's very clear to address these structural challenges. There are some things and solutions which already exist. We know the market design guidance which exists. We need to acknowledge today that the acceleration of renewable energy will lead to other needs. That is one aspect. But we also need to work together very differently and go out of our comfort zone and have much more integrated approaches. Clearly, using policies to actively support renewable energy across all energy sectors. I just take the example of e-mobility. E-mobility is very present in the economic recovery packages. It's quite present in the NDCs, and there are only 2 countries that actively link, so have an integrated approach to renewable-based e-mobility. Only 2 countries. And many of the countries that do push for e-mobility do not have in parallel renewable energy plans and targets. So there is clearly something about integration of policy frameworks. Obviously, making energy efficiency mandatory to decrease the energy demand, because renewable alone cannot do it. And when it comes to phasing out fossil fuels, there is clearly an aspect of removing fossil fuel subsidies, but we need to go further to really address the structural changes. Banning fossil fuel, in particular in heating and transport, which are highly dependent on these sectors, and especially when we look at road transport in the building sector, there are solutions that exist. Also on the investment side, divest from fossil fuel. As Ricardo had mentioned, clearly using public procurement to create markets, because there is a need to also create economic opportunities and accompany market players to engage in the transition, to really make the step of transitioning their own businesses. And here reskilling, but also in the integrated industrial strategy is important. And the innovation here is not only technological innovation. And the other part is clearly to actively build citizen support. So we need large scale, and we also need local and decentralized solutions to really have all players around the table. So the conclusion is today, there is a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution. And this means that basically when we're talking about renewable energy, or when we're talking about the energy transition, we need many, many different players around the table who are today not always participating in creating the right planning, policy, and regulative framework. Thank you very much for your attention.